Hello, I'm Annette Young and welcome to this special edition of the 51%. This week we're in the southern French town of Arles, which since 1970 has hosted an international photographic festival and which these days is working hard to give more exposure to women photographers. Les Rencontres d'Arles seeks to highlight those forgotten women behind the lens. Marta Gilly is the director of the ENSP, a leading school of photography in France. She's also a contributor to a recently published history of female photographers. We caught up with her in Arles. This book that you've contributed to is a wonderful voyage of discovery about female photographers. But why is it that we don't know much about these individuals?
Well, I think that there are many reasons. And I think one of the most important reasons is institutional reason. So many of these photographers, women photographers, they were there, they were working, they were professional. But they didn't have this kind of visibility in newspapers, magazines, museums, collections. In this case, this book for me is very important because they are kind of compilating works from different countries, women from different countries and different aesthetics, photojournalism, photodocumentary photography, portraits, landscapes, but many of them, they are very engaged with the reality and the society that they were or they are living.
Is there such a thing as a female perspective when it comes to photography?
I don't think so. I think that photography is a tool. And this tool allows us, women and men, to look at the world in many different ways and in many different subjectivities. So, no, I don't think that it's a specific way of taking pictures for women or for men. What is specific today, I think it's that photography can give us the possibility to take a look to what we don't see.
Given the lack of female photographers, how has that impacted the way that we, the viewer, the consumer, digest those images?
Probably what is the lack of visibility of these photographers, women photographers, has given us a way to look at the world, which is very patriarchal and hegemonic. And what is interesting is that many women, like Susan Meiselas, for instance, they are open a kind of new vision, new gaze to which is something that we are not used to, but it was already existing. So I think that if we can say that there's something specific in some women photographers, is that they are inventing a new way to look at what's going on around us.
Marta, thank you so much.
Thank you.
During the festival, the town of Arles becomes a gigantic photographic gallery. Here in this church is an exhibition celebrating the nominees of this year's prestigious Louis Roder Prize. We meet two photographers whose work is featured.
I was thinking about the history of photography as a woman of color, how much of the history of photography is presented as kind of a parade of white father figures. And I wanted to really think about how I could engage with that history as a woman of color. And when I was looking more closely at Weston's work, I noticed that many of his models were women. They were also his students and many times his collaborators and his lovers. And many of them are unnamed. So I started putting myself in their positions, reenacting their poses, and also performing as both photographer and subject. So in a way, I'm pointing to myself as, the master rewriting history, writing myself into this canonical work, but also kind of bringing forward those women who were sort of eliminated from the history of photography.
So I think what's interesting about my part of the world in particular is there is this almost time lag where when we were growing up, it would take a couple of months for things that were cool in culture to reach us. You know, we just didn't have the same kind of lines of communication and trade open with the Western world. So I think that photography really powerfully, you know, it frees us time, it stops it. I really hope that people will find something familiar in the work, even if it's a world that they don't connect with culturally, even if they've never been to my part of the world. I hope that there is something about humanity that might speak to somebody, you know, who is passing by the photographs.
Sexualised imagery of women in photography is a common theme, but at this year's festival, a major exhibition reveals how masculinity has been socially constructed since the 1960s. It brings together the works of more than 50 international photographers and filmmakers, such as Laurie Anderson and Catherine Opie. Its curator, Alona Pardo, took us for a tour. How did this exhibition come about?
Well, I was really interested. The show was conceived in 2016 at a moment of the Me Too movement was emerging and, you know, creating ripples, and also this kind of emergence of a masculinist nationalism with the kind of election of Bolsonaro and Trump and other figures that kind of embodying kind of, you know, very traditional forms of masculinity. And I really wanted to think about, also it was a moment of revisiting the women's liberation or the feminist movement. And I really wanted to understand, well, what do exhibitions about the representation of the male form look like? What have we got? Who do we need to bring down? How has that been mythologized? How has that been pictured? And so that was really the kind of emphasis of the show. I wanted to do a show that was looking at how that masculinity is as a gender is equally as constructed and performed and coded as femininity or any other kind of marginalised masculinity.
And when you look at all these images, it really does come across, dare I say, as a feminist exhibition.
It's absolutely a feminist exhibition. We could also replace that word with queer. It's also a queer exhibition. It's looking at subverting, disrupting, disturbing these very kind of received representations of masculinity, and all of the artists really are trying to break loose of this kind of straitjacket of these very narrow definitions of gender that have come down to us through the ages.
Also, looking at the photos, the thing that strikes me the most is the fragility of what exactly is masculinity.
Well, there's a deep-rooted fear, in fact, of masculinity about its own collapse, which is why it always needs to be scaffolded up through. There's a section in the show called Male Order, looking at power and patriarchy in space. And it's exactly that. It's this fear of its own demise, which is why it has to subordinate or position itself as oppositional to and superior to not only femininity, so the female, but also to other forms of masculinity, because ultimately there's a hierarchy of masculine gender, on top which sits the white heterosexual male, and it goes down the list. So there is this absolute sense of its own fragility, of its sense of its own collapse, which is absolutely fascinating. And there are some beautiful moments in the show looking at kind of fatherhood and family and a lot of tenderness and vulnerability, but also looking at the idea of athletes and sports people, this idea of the theatre, of how men or masculinity needs to perform itself, and it performs itself in the arena of sports, in business, in the workplace, in the bedroom. And so there's always this idea of its own performativity, and ultimately that performativity has to collapse at some point, and artists have set out to challenge that, to subvert that.
Are there any images here that really sort of resonate with you?
That each one is my own particular favourite, and I have reasons for that. But I mean, obviously we're here next to Cathy Opie's incredible work called Being and Having from 1991. So this was a work that was made, just a year after Judith Butler's, seminal publication, Gender Troubling. And what we have here in these 13 photographs is Cathy Opie, who's pictured there as a self-portrait of her at the top left-hand corner, and her community, her very close community of S&M friends in the West Coast scene during the late 80s and early 90s. And what we have here are her group of lesbian friends, all mimicking manliness. They're wearing these false moustaches. They're using these kind of hyper-masculine tropes. Just to say that, you know, particularly the lesbian is being seen as a thief of masculinity. They're not female enough to be women, but they're not male enough to be men. And in fact, she would argue that they don't want to be either. They want to exist in a world where they don't have to conform to these very strict binary codes.
Alona, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.
We're here at the region's newest attraction, the Frank Gehry Design Luma Arles complex is also where the works of iconic photographers such as Annie Leibovitz and Diane Arbus are on display. That's it for this special edition, so until our next show, bye for now.